all set in motion by a desperate widow's impulsive purchase of an abandoned train station she could barely afford. A crumbling Victorian-era depot in a forgotten Georgia town that would eventually bring historians from the Smithsonian Institution to her doorstep, trigger emergency authentication meetings at the National Archives, and ultimately reveal a secret vault containing Confederate gold that had remained hidden for over 150 years. A discovery that would rewrite Civil War history books and transform one woman's story of loss into an extraordinary legacy of historical significance. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me share how a single moment of courage changed everything for a woman who had lost all hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell reviewed the past due notices spread across her kitchen table, the harsh reality of her financial situation illuminated by early morning sunlight streaming through worn curtains. Her modest rental home on the outskirts of Atlanta, with its leaking roof and outdated appliances, represented the dramatic downturn her life had taken in the 18 months since losing her husband. The stack of bills, mortgage payments, 3 months behind, medical expenses from Robert's cancer treatments, and credit card debt accumulated during his illness totaled more than $47,000, an impossible sum for a woman now working 2 part-time jobs just to keep the lights on. Her fingers trembled slightly as she calculated how many more weeks she could maintain minimum payments before facing eviction. The laptop before her displayed her bank account balance, $842.17, barely enough to cover groceries and gas for the month, leaving nothing for the mortgage payment due in 8 days. Each screen represented another piece of the financial puzzle that Sarah couldn't solve, no matter how many hours she worked or expenses she cut. The morning's job search had yielded nothing promising, each rejection email reinforcing the brutal reality that her 20 years as an elementary school librarian provided few transferable skills for the competitive Atlanta job market. Sarah was 52 years old, competing against candidates half her age for positions that offered half the salary she once earned before budget cuts eliminated her position at Westlake Elementary. Her teaching degree and master's in library science had once represented security and purpose. Now they seemed like relics from another lifetime, credentials that couldn't protect her from the financial devastation that had accompanied Robert's illness and death. The medical bills alone exceeded $200,000, most covered by insurance but leaving copays and deductibles that had consumed their modest savings within months of his diagnosis. The life insurance policy that should have provided financial stability had lapsed 3 months before Robert's diagnosis, a paperwork oversight during a company transition that transformed what would have been a $350,000 safety net into a catastrophic void. The insurance company's rejection letter remained pinned to Sarah's refrigerator, a daily reminder of how quickly security could vanish through simple administrative error. But the numbers only told part of Sarah's story, a story that had begun 30 years earlier when she'd met Robert Mitchell during their sophomore year at the University of Georgia. Their romance had blossomed amid textbooks and coffee shops, where Robert's quiet intelligence and unwavering support had helped Sarah overcome her natural shyness and discover her passion for children's literature and education. Robert, an architectural engineer with a gift for restoring historic buildings, had built their life together with the same attention to detail he brought to his professional projects. Their modest colonial-style home in a quiet Atlanta suburb, purchased when property values were reasonable, had been Robert's pride, each renovation completed with his own hands during weekends and holidays. The garden where Sarah had grown heirloom tomatoes and fragrant herbs had been her sanctuary, a place where neighborhood children gathered for summer reading programs Sarah organized voluntarily. Their daughter Emily, now 26 and teaching English in Spain, had grown up surrounded by books and blueprints, developing both Sarah's love of literature and Robert's appreciation for structural integrity. The monthly video calls with Emily had become increasingly difficult as Sarah struggled to maintain a facade of stability, not wanting to burden her daughter with financial concerns that might cut short her European adventure. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Emily had asked during their most recent conversation, her perceptive eyes noticing the strain in Sarah's smile and the unfamiliar background of the rental kitchen. "You know I can come home if you need me." "I'm adjusting," Sarah had replied, deflecting her daughter's concern with practiced cheerfulness. "Just taking some time to figure out next steps. Your father would want you to continue your work in Madrid. You're making such a difference with those students." The truth was far more complicated and frightening than Sarah could admit to her daughter. The illness that had taken Robert had also consumed their financial stability, their home, and Sarah's sense of identity. The woman who had once hosted book clubs and community events now worked mornings, stocking shelves at a local grocery store, and evenings as an administrative assistant at a dental practice, positions that together provided barely enough income to cover essential expenses. Sarah's transformation from respected educator to anonymous hourly worker had been accompanied by the isolation that often follows dramatic life changes. Former colleagues expressed sympathy but gradually disappeared from her life as their paths diverged. Neighbors from their old community sent occasional messages that seemed uncomfortable with the stark reality of Sarah's downsized existence. Even family members, while offering emotional support, had their own financial challenges that prevented meaningful assistance. The community where Sarah now rented a small duplex was unfamiliar territory, populated by younger residents who worked irregular hours and seemed disconnected from the neighborhood cohesion she had once valued. Her attempts to establish relationships had yielded polite but distant interactions, leaving her to navigate grief and financial crisis largely alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The small dining table where Sarah now reviewed her finances had been purchased from the thrift store, along with most of her current furnishings. The beautiful cherry wood dining set that Robert had restored for their 10th anniversary had been sold, along with most of their quality furniture, to cover living expenses during the months following his death. Each piece represented memories and milestones now converted to temporary financial relief. Dr. Karen Lewis, Sarah's grief counselor during the months after Robert's death, had recognized the dual trauma of losing both a spouse and financial security simultaneously. "You're experiencing compound loss," she had explained during their sessions at the Community Support Center that offered free counseling to widows and widowers. Each change reinforces the others, creating a cascade effect that can feel overwhelming. The counseling had provided emotional strategies for managing grief, but practical solutions for financial recovery remained elusive. Sarah had depleted her retirement savings, sold valuable possessions, and downsized to the smallest possible living space, yet still struggled to establish sustainable financial stability. The part-time positions that currently provided her income offered no benefits, leaving her without health insurance at an age when medical concerns were becoming increasingly relevant. The marketplace insurance options required monthly premiums that exceeded her budget, creating another layer of anxiety about potential illness or injury. Sarah's professional attempts to return to education had been consistently disappointing. School districts facing budget constraints were hiring younger teachers at lower salary levels, while private schools sought specialists with technological expertise that Sarah's traditional training hadn't emphasized. The library science degree that had once opened doors now seemed outdated in an era of digital media specialists and coding instructors. Most disheartening were the well-meaning suggestions from friends and former colleagues that failed to recognize the realities of age discrimination and financial urgency. "Have you thought about substitute teaching? Or maybe you could start a tutoring business, came from people who hadn't needed to rebuild a career in their 50s while managing crushing debt and emotional trauma. The morning sunlight that illuminated Sarah's financial documents also revealed the calendar, where she tracked job applications and payment deadlines. The coming week included 3 job interviews, a customer service position at a call center, an administrative role at a local hospital, and a circulation desk opening at a community college library. Each represented potential stability, though none offered the salary or benefits that would significantly improve her financial situation. The most promising opportunity had appeared unexpectedly 2 days earlier when Sarah had received a call from Margaret Reynolds, the director of a small historical society in Oakwood, a rural community approximately 90 miles southeast of Atlanta. The society was seeking a part-time archivist to catalog donated materials and create educational resources for local schools. "We can only offer 15 hours weekly at $18 per hour, Margaret had explained, her voice apologetic, but warm. "But your background in education and library science would be perfect for helping us organize our collection and make it accessible to students and researchers." The position wouldn't solve Sarah's financial problems, but it represented a return to meaningful work that utilized her professional skills. The 3-hour weekly commute would consume gas money and vehicle wear, but Sarah had immediately scheduled an interview, desperate to reconnect with work that offered purpose beyond survival. As Sarah finished reviewing her finances that morning, her phone displayed a notification from a real estate app she had installed months earlier when still hoping to find affordable housing closer to Atlanta's job opportunities. The notification highlighted a property auction in Oakwood, the same small town, where she had scheduled the Historical Society interview. The listing showed a dilapidated Victorian train station being auctioned by the county tax authority. With a minimum bid of $600, the building, vacant for more than 30 years according to the description, had fallen into significant disrepair, but retained architectural elements typical of rural Southern railroad depots from the 1880s. Sarah's finger hovered over the listing, memories surfacing of Robert's passion for historic architecture and his particular interest in transportation buildings from the post-Civil War Reconstruction era. How many times had they detoured during family road trips to explore abandoned train stations and decommissioned depots that Robert documented in his architectural journals? "These buildings tell America's expansion story," he would explain to Emily, pointing out construction details that revealed historical context. The Victorian embellishments weren't just decorative. They represented civic pride and economic optimism during challenging times. The auction listing included interior photos showing collapsed ceiling sections, water damage to floors, and windows boarded with weathered plywood. Despite the deterioration, Sarah could recognize the quality craftsmanship in the remaining woodwork. The elegant proportions of the waiting room and the ticket counters detailed millwork that had somehow survived decades of neglect. The property included approximately 3 acres surrounding the station, though the listing noted that environmental assessment would be the buyer's responsibility. The auction was scheduled for tomorrow, the same day as Sarah's interview. With the Historical Society, perhaps a coincidence that felt momentarily significant. "This is ridiculous," Sarah muttered, closing the app and returning to her job search. The idea of purchasing an abandoned train station when she could barely afford her current rent was clearly impractical, regardless of the sentimental connection to Robert's architectural interests. Yet throughout the day, as Sarah completed her morning shift at the grocery store and prepared for her evening work at the dental office, images of the train station resurfaced in her thoughts. The $600 minimum bid represented most of her remaining bank balance, money designated for essential expenses rather than impulsive property purchases. The rational decision was obviously to focus on immediate needs rather than romantic notions about historic preservation. That evening, after completing her shift at the dental office, Sarah found herself reopening the auction listing and studying the property details more carefully. The county's decision to auction the station resulted from decades of unpaid property taxes and mounting code violations that local government was unwilling to address. The minimum bid reflected the property's perceived liability rather than potential value, with the county assessor's notes explicitly mentioning structural concerns and potential environmental issues. Still, something about the station called to Sarah, perhaps representing the possibility of connection to Robert's memory or simply an alternative to the grinding financial struggle that had defined her life since his death. The impulsive thought of redirecting her remaining funds towards something completely unexpected felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah spent hours researching Oakwood's economic situation, learning that the small town had experienced modest revitalization through heritage tourism and relocation of urban professionals seeking affordable property within commuting distance of Augusta. The Historical Society position suddenly seemed potentially connected to larger possibilities, though Sarah recognized she might be constructing elaborate justifications for an emotional decision. The following morning, Sarah drove the 90 miles to Oakwood with her interview materials for the Historical Society position and her bank information for the property auction, still uncertain which represented her actual purpose for the journey. The small town appeared around a curve in the highway, its modest main street lined with buildings that reflected both historical significance and economic challenges. The interview with Margaret Reynolds proceeded better than Sarah had anticipated. Their shared passion for making historical materials accessible to students creating immediate professional rapport. The position's 15 weekly hours could potentially expand if grant applications proved successful, and the work environment, a converted Victorian home near the town center, offered the warmth and purpose that Sarah had missed since leaving education. We're hoping to develop stronger connections with regional universities and state archives, Margaret explained as she showed Sarah the Society's collection storage. There's significant Civil War history in this area that hasn't been properly documented or preserved. The conversation reinforced Sarah's interest in the position while raising questions about Oakwood's historical significance that made the train station property increasingly intriguing. When the interview concluded, Sarah had nearly 2 hours before the property auction was scheduled to begin at the county administrative building. "The old Oakwood station is being auctioned today," Sarah mentioned casually as she prepared to leave. "I noticed it on a real estate listing and was curious about its history." Margaret's expression immediately registered recognition and concern. "That poor building has been deteriorating for decades. The Historical Society tried to save it years ago, but funding for preservation never materialized. It was an important transportation hub during Reconstruction and rumored to have connections to Confederate treasury movements after Richmond fell." The additional historical context only intensified Sarah's interest, connecting the property to exactly the type of architectural and historical significance that Robert would have found fascinating. The 90-minute drive home after her interview would give her plenty of time to reconsider the financial implications of attending the auction. But Sarah already suspected that her decision had been made when she first saw the listing. The county administrative building where the auction was scheduled occupied a converted bank building on Oakwood's main street. The modestly sized meeting room contained fewer than a dozen attendees, mostly representatives from development companies and construction firms, interested in commercial properties with higher assessed values than the abandoned train station. When the station property was announced, Sarah raised her bidding card with hesitation that quickly transformed to disbelief when no competing bids emerged. The auctioneer repeated the property description and minimum bid, scanning the room for interest before declaring, "Going once, going twice," with professional efficiency. "Sold to bidder number 17 for $600, the auctioneer announced, already moving toward the next property listing while Sarah struggled to process what had just occurred. She had purchased a historic train station with nearly all her remaining funds, a decision that simultaneously felt like the most irresponsible and most authentic choice she had made since Robert's death. The paperwork processing required another hour, during which county officials provided minimal information about the property while emphasizing that the sale was final and as is with no warranties or guarantees regarding structural integrity or environmental conditions. Sarah signed documents transferring ownership while a part of her mind screamed about financial irresponsibility and another part felt curiously liberated by choosing possibility over security. Driving back to Atlanta that evening, Sarah alternated between panic about her impulsive purchase and unexpected excitement about owning a piece of history that Robert would have treasured. The practical challenges were enormous. The station required extensive repairs before being habitable or commercially viable, and her financial situation remained precarious with most of her liquid assets now converted to a dilapidated property 90 miles from her current residence. Yet something about the decision felt right in ways that Sarah couldn't fully articulate, as if the train station represented possibilities beyond her current circumstances rather than another burden to manage. She would need to explain the purchase to Emily during their next video call, a conversation that would require careful framing to prevent her daughter from abandoning her Spanish teaching position out of concern for her mother's stability. 3-bedroom rental that awaited Sarah in Atlanta suddenly seemed like a temporary way station rather than home, its anonymity and absence of personal history contrasting sharply with the historical significance of the property she had just purchased. The financial reality remained daunting. She still needed stable employment and income to address existing debts, but the train station offered an alternative narrative to the story of loss and diminishment that had defined the past 18 months. That evening, Sarah spread Robert's architectural journals across her dining table, searching for references to Southern Railroad depots and Victorian transportation buildings that might provide insight into her new property's historical context and structural characteristics. The familiar handwriting and detailed sketches reconnected her to Robert's passion in ways that felt healing rather than painful for the first time since his death. One journal entry from 15 years earlier described a restored depot in Virginia that had been converted to a regional museum, with the station master's office transformed into a research library and the waiting room serving as exhibition space. Robert's enthusiasm for the adaptive reuse was evident in his detailed notes about preserving original architectural elements while accommodating modern functions. These buildings were designed to welcome travelers and connect communities. Robert had written beside a careful sketch of decorative woodwork, "Their rehabilitation should honor that original purpose while finding new ways to serve as gathering places for today's communities." Sarah fell asleep that night, surrounded by Robert's journals, her dreams filled with images of restored Victorian woodwork and sunlight streaming through tall windows. The financial anxiety that had dominated her thoughts for months was temporarily displaced by possibilities that connected her past with potential futures she hadn't previously considered. The following morning, Sarah contacted the Historical Society to formally accept the part-time position, explaining to Margaret that she had actually purchased the train station and was interested in learning more about its historical significance. To the community, Margaret's surprise quickly transformed to enthusiasm about the potential for preservation, offering resources and connections that might help Sarah evaluate the property's condition and restoration possibilities. "The station has a fascinating history," Margaret explained during their phone conversation. "It was built in 1882 during the post-Reconstruction economic expansion and served as an important transportation link between Atlanta and Savannah. Local legend suggests it played a role in moving Confederate assets during the final days of the Civil War, though documentation is limited." The historical context reinforced Sarah's sense that the impulsive purchase might have deeper significance than initially apparent. She arranged to meet Margaret at the station the following Saturday, allowing time to organize her work schedule and research restoration requirements for historically significant properties. The week passed in a blur of practical arrangements, with Sarah's mind constantly returning to the train station and its possibilities while she completed her shifts at the grocery store and dental office. She contacted Emily via email, describing the Historical Society position in detail, but mentioning the station purchase only briefly as an interesting property investment connected to your father's architectural interests. The deliberately vague description was designed to prevent Emily from worrying about Sarah's financial decisions while still sharing the development that had brought unexpected energy and purpose to her life. The response came within hours. Emily's enthusiasm about the Historical Society position, accompanied by curious questions about the property that Sarah promised to answer during their next video call. By Saturday morning, when Sarah made the 90-minute drive to Oakwood, she had developed a preliminary assessment plan based on Robert's restoration journals and online research about historical preservation standards. The station's exterior appeared both more impressive and more deteriorated in daylight than the auction listing photos had suggested, its Victorian architectural details still evident despite decades of neglect. Margaret Reynolds was waiting in the small gravel area that had once served as the station's passenger drop-off zone, her expression reflecting both concern about the building's condition and excitement about its potential preservation. "I brought the Historical Society's files about the station," she explained, gesturing to a portfolio case, including some photographs from the early 1900s when it was still operational. Together, they approached the padlocked entrance where county officials had provided keys during the property transfer. The heavy wooden door, swollen with moisture and age, required both women's effort to open, revealing an interior filled with decades of dust, debris from collapsed ceiling sections, and evidence of wildlife having found entrance through broken windows. Despite the deterioration, Sarah could immediately recognize the quality craftsmanship in the remaining architectural elements. The ticket counter's detailed woodwork remained largely intact, protected by its solid oak construction. The waiting room's high ceilings, though partially collapsed in sections, featured decorative molding characteristic of Victorian public buildings. The station master's office still contained built-in filing cabinets with brass hardware that had developed a beautiful patina beneath layers of dust. The Historical Society documented the station in 1978 when there was discussion about preservation. Margaret explained, showing Sarah black and white photographs that revealed the building in significantly better condition. The architectural details were considered regionally significant examples of Victorian transportation design. As they carefully moved through the space, assessing damage and preservation possibilities, Sarah felt growing conviction that the impulsive purchase hadn't been mere sentimentality. The station, despite its condition, represented exactly the type of historical restoration project that Robert had valued throughout his career, a building with both architectural significance and community history that could potentially serve new purposes while honoring its original function. The main waiting room's western wall featured a massive fireplace constructed from local stone, its mantel crafted from oak with intricate carvings depicting railroad scenes. The fireplace appeared structurally sound despite decades without maintenance, its craftsmanship suggesting importance beyond typical station design. "That's unusual for a station this size," Margaret noted, examining the fireplace more closely. Most depots use simpler heating systems rather than decorative fireplaces of this quality. Sarah ran her fingers along the carved oak, feeling connections to the craftsmen who had created the detailed work and to Robert, who would have appreciated their skill. The mantel's central panel depicted a steam locomotive passing through mountain terrain, the carving so precise that individual rivets were visible on the engine's boiler. The Historical Society records mention something unusual about this fireplace. Margaret continued, consulting her files. There was speculation about hidden storage compartments, which wasn't uncommon in buildings of this era, particularly in southern states during and after the Civil War. Sarah's exploration of the mantel revealed no obvious mechanisms or compartments, though decades of paint and grime obscured finer details. The fireplace's dimensions seemed slightly disproportionate to the surrounding wall, possibly suggesting hollow areas within the stonework, though confirming such speculation would require professional assessment. The station's back rooms, originally used for freight processing and storage, contained water-damaged flooring and evidence of structural shifting that would require significant engineering intervention. The ticket office featured a trapdoor leading to a small cellar that had apparently been used for coal storage, its dirt floor now muddy from groundwater seepage that would need addressing before any restoration could proceed. By late afternoon, Sarah and Margaret had documented the station's condition through photographs and notes, creating a preliminary assessment that would help determine restoration priorities and potential costs. The magnitude of the project was daunting, particularly given Sarah's financial constraints, but the building's historical significance and architectural integrity justified preservation efforts that might attract grants or historical society support. "There's genuine historical value here," Margaret assured Sarah as they secured the building and prepared to leave. The Historical Society would certainly support grant applications for preservation, especially if you're considering uses that would benefit the community. The drive back to Atlanta that evening gave Sarah time to process both the enormous challenges and unexpected possibilities that the station represented. The practical obstacles were significant. Restoration costs would far exceed her current resources, and the building wasn't immediately habitable as living space or commercially viable without substantial investment. Yet Sarah felt more energized and purposeful than she had at any point since Robert's death. The station represented connection to his professional passion and to historical narratives larger than her personal losses. For the first time in 18 months, she was making decisions based on possibility rather than mere survival. That night, Sarah created a preliminary project plan based on Robert's restoration journals, identifying critical structural issues that required immediate attention while mapping longer-term rehabilitation goals. The financial calculations remained daunting, but breaking the project into manageable phases made the overall scope seem less overwhelming. The most immediate concern was stabilizing the building's structure to prevent further deterioration. While Sarah researched funding options and potential partnerships with preservation organizations, the leaking roof and water infiltration issues required addressing before fall rains created additional damage, a timeline that added urgency to securing resources. As Sarah reviewed the photographs she had taken that day, one detail from the main fireplace caught her attention: a small inconsistency in the stonework near the right side of the hearth, where the pattern of mortar lines didn't match surrounding areas. The irregularity was subtle but suggested potential modification at some point after original construction, perhaps related to Margaret's mention of hidden storage compartments. The discovery added another layer of intrigue to the project, connecting the station not just to architectural history, but potentially to civil war narratives about Confederate assets moved during the conflict's final days. Sarah made a note to research this aspect more thoroughly, recognizing that historical documentation might provide context for the structural anomalies. Falling asleep that night, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had been absent since Robert's illness. The train station represented not just a building requiring restoration, but a train station represented not just a building represented connection to history and community that offered meaning beyond financial calculations. The woman who had been merely surviving was beginning to envision possibilities for creating something valuable from what others had discarded as worthless. The practical challenges remained enormous, and the financial risks significant. But for the first time since becoming a widow, Sarah was making decisions based on hope rather than fear. The transformation had begun, though she could not yet imagine how completely the abandoned train station would change her understanding of both history and her own capacity for rebuilding from ruins. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in October, when Sarah discovered that the property taxes for her newly acquired train station had tripled since the county assessor's last valuation. She stared at her laptop screen in confusion, refreshing the county tax portal 3 times before calling the assessor's office to report what she assumed must be a system error. "I'm showing a revised assessment based on potential commercial value and historical significance," the clerk explained after Sarah provided her property identification number. The county revalues properties after transfer of ownership, and the historical registry status of the Oakwood station triggered automatic reassessment. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she processed this information. The modest property tax she had anticipated in her already strained budget was now an impossible $4,800 annually, due in full within 60 days. The calculation had been based on potential commercial value rather than the building's actual deteriorated condition, creating a financial obligation that Sarah had no means to fulfill. "There must be some mistake," Sarah told the representative, her voice shaking slightly as she began to comprehend the implications. "I purchased a dilapidated building that requires extensive restoration before it has any practical value." The $600 purchase price reflected its actual condition. But even as she spoke, Sarah was beginning to remember troubling details from the auction paperwork that she had signed without fully understanding the implications. The fine print had mentioned tax reassessment upon transfer, with historical properties subject to specialized valuation procedures that considered cultural significance rather than merely physical condition. The clerk explained that Sarah could appeal the assessment, but the process would take months and require professional appraisals documenting the building's structural issues. The immediate reality was that Sarah now faced an impossible financial obligation that threatened to consume her remaining resources while potentially forcing her to abandon the property before restoration could even begin. This devastating revelation was only the beginning of a cascade of problems that would ultimately consume not only Sarah's modest savings, but also her hopes for establishing a new life in Oakwood. 2 days after the tax assessment notice, a certified letter arrived from the county building department informing Sarah that the station required immediate structural stabilization to comply with safety codes. Failure to address critical structural deficiencies within 30 days will result in condemnation proceedings. The letter stated in bureaucratic language that masked the human implications of such requirements. The estimated cost for the mandatory repairs exceeded $15,000, money that Sarah simply didn't have. Each new challenge revealed how thoroughly unprepared Sarah had been for the realities of historic property ownership. The impulsive purchase that had momentarily connected her to Robert's passion for architectural preservation was rapidly becoming a financial catastrophe that threatened to consume her remaining resources while providing no viable path forward. The part-time position at the Historical Society, while intellectually fulfilling, provided barely enough income to cover Sarah's commuting costs and basic living expenses. The 15 hours weekly at $18 per hour generated only $270 before taxes, insufficient for addressing the mounting financial obligations associated with the station property. Margaret Reynolds had been supportive when Sarah explained the tax assessment challenge, offering to write letters confirming the building's poor condition and historical significance that justified preservation rather than commercial valuation. But Margaret's own resources were limited by the Historical Society's modest budget, and her ability to influence county officials was constrained by bureaucratic procedures that prioritized revenue generation over preservation concerns. "The Society might be able to help with documentation for your appeal," Margaret explained during their conversation about the assessment. But our own funding is extremely limited this year after budget cuts reduced our grant allocations. The initial excitement about potential restoration had been replaced by anxiety that grew with each new document detailing requirements, restrictions, and financial obligations associated with the property. Sarah's dreams of gradually rehabilitating the station while developing connections to Oakwood's community were being crushed beneath regulatory requirements that seemed designed to make preservation impossible for anyone without substantial financial resources. 3 weeks after purchasing the station, Sarah received notification that her application for emergency preservation funds through the State Historical Commission had been rejected due to incomplete documentation and questions about ownership viability. The rejection letter mentioned concerns about financial capacity to maintain historically significant properties as a primary consideration in denying support. Sarah's attempts to secure traditional financing for the necessary repairs were equally unsuccessful. Banks and credit unions viewed the dilapidated station as a liability rather than an asset, and Sarah's part-time employment and existing debt made her an unacceptable risk even for small personal loans that might have addressed the most critical structural issues. The weather seemed to conspire against Sarah's preservation efforts as well. Heavy October rains found new entry points through the station's deteriorating roof, creating water damage to interior walls and ceilings that accelerated the building's decline. Each visit to assess new damage revealed additional problems that would require addressing before any meaningful restoration could begin. Most heartbreaking was Sarah's growing realization that she might need to abandon the property entirely, accepting financial loss and emotional disappointment rather than continuing to pursue restoration that seemed increasingly impossible. The dream of creating something meaningful from the historic building was fading beneath practical realities that couldn't be overcome through determination alone. "I think I've made a terrible mistake," Sarah admitted to Emily during their monthly video call, finally revealing the full extent of the financial challenges associated with the train station. "I purchased something I can't possibly afford to maintain or restore, and now I'm facing tax obligations that exceed my entire income." Emily's concern was immediately evident, her expression reflecting worry about her mother's financial situation and emotional well-being. "Mom, why didn't you tell me how serious this was? I could have helped you think through the implications before you committed to such a big project." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, with Sarah acknowledging that emotional connection to Robert's architectural interests had influenced a decision that should have been based on practical financial assessment. Emily offered to return from Spain to help address the situation, but Sarah refused to allow her daughter's career to be interrupted by problems created through her own impulsive choices. "This is my responsibility to resolve," Sarah insisted, though she had no clear strategy for addressing the mounting challenges. "You're doing important work in Madrid, and I need to figure this out myself." In truth, Sarah was beginning to accept that resolution might require abandoning the station and absorbing whatever financial losses resulted. The county tax office had been unsympathetic to her appeals for reassessment. The building department remained firm about required structural repairs, and potential funding sources had been exhausted without success. The emotional toll of watching her preservation hopes collapse was affecting Sarah's performance at her part-time jobs and the Historical Society position. She was sleeping poorly, losing weight despite irregular eating habits, and developing chronic anxiety that accompanied every piece of mail that might contain additional bad news about the station property. 6 weeks after purchasing the station, Sarah made the difficult decision to explore options for divesting the property while minimizing financial damage. The county tax assessor's office suggested tax foreclosure would eventually occur if obligations remained unpaid, but this process would damage Sarah's credit rating while potentially creating additional liability for demolition costs if the county determined The structure was unsalvageable. A local real estate agent who specialized in distressed properties offered even more discouraging news after viewing the station. "The commercial value is entirely in the land," she explained bluntly. "The building itself is considered a liability by most developers because demolition costs would exceed potential return on investment in this market." The agent suggested listing the property for $2,000 to attract investors interested in the land value alone, accepting that the historic structure would likely be demolished despite its architectural significance. Even this deeply discounted price might not generate immediate interest given the property's condition and location in a town with limited commercial development. The prospect of selling the station for potential demolition felt like personal failure and betrayal of both historical preservation values and connection to Robert's memory. Yet Sarah's financial reality offered few alternatives as tax deadlines approached and structural deterioration continued accelerating with each rainfall. What made the situation even more painful was that Sarah had begun developing genuine connection to Oakwood's community through her work at the Historical Society. Local residents had expressed excitement about potential restoration of the station, sharing family stories about its role in the community's development and historical significance beyond merely architectural details. Elderly residents remembered when the station had still been operational in their childhood, serving as a transportation hub that connected Oakwood to larger cities and economies. Their personal histories included waiting for relatives arriving by train, shipping agricultural products to distant markets, and witnessing the station's gradual decline as railroad service diminished in the mid-20th century. These community connections made the potential failure even more difficult to accept, as Sarah recognized that the station represented not just a building but a physical manifestation of local heritage that would be permanently lost if she couldn't find solutions to the financial challenges threatening preservation. 2 months after her impulsive purchase, Sarah visited the station on a cold November morning to document additional storm damage for insurance purposes. The trip represented acknowledgement that preservation was becoming impossible and protection against further financial liability would require accurate documentation of deterioration that occurred through weather rather than neglect. The station looked particularly forlorn in the gray November light, its architectural details still evident beneath peeling paint and rotting woodwork. Sarah unlocked the heavy main door, its hinges protesting with familiar creaking that she had come to recognize during her increasingly discouraging visits. The main waiting room where she had once envisioned community gatherings and historical exhibitions was now partially flooded from recent rains, with water pooling on the original hardwood floors and accelerating damage to irreplaceable materials. The ticket counter where travelers had once purchased passage to distant destinations was now streaked with water stains from ceiling leaks that Sarah had no resources to repair. Most disappointing was the damage to the ornate fireplace that had initially captured Sarah's imagination with its detailed craftsmanship and potential historical significance. Water infiltration through the chimney had created new cracks in the stonework, revealing structural issues that would require expert mason work to address. As Sarah photographed the fireplace damage, she noticed that the irregular mortar section she had previously identified appeared to have shifted further, creating a gap between stones that hadn't been visible during earlier inspections. The movement was concerning from a structural perspective, suggesting potential instability that might represent safety hazards beyond merely aesthetic deterioration. Setting her camera aside, Sarah examined the area more closely, her fingers tracing the edges of stones that had clearly been reinstalled at some point after original construction. The irregular pattern became more obvious with careful inspection, revealing what appeared to be deliberate modification rather than random structural settlement. The gap between stones was now large enough that Sarah could feel air movement from behind the masonry, suggesting hollow space within the chimney, structure that didn't align with typical fireplace design. Retrieving a flashlight from her supply bag, Sarah directed light into the gap, revealing what appeared to be an enclosed chamber behind the fireplace facing. "This isn't right," Sarah murmured, her preservation research having provided enough knowledge about historic construction techniques to recognize that the void behind the stonework wasn't consistent with standard chimney design from the 1880s. Curiosity temporarily displaced disappointment as Sarah retrieved tools from her car, returning with a small pry bar that allowed her to carefully explore the loose stonework without causing additional damage. The mortar surrounding several stones crumbled easily, suggesting previous disturbance rather than original construction, and confirming Sarah's suspicion that the area had been modified after the fireplace was initially built. Working methodically to avoid structural damage, Sarah removed several smaller stones, creating an opening approximately 8 inches square that revealed a dark cavity behind the fireplace facing. The flashlight beam illuminated what appeared to be a metal door set into the brick chimney structure, its surface covered with accumulated soot and grime, but clearly distinguishable as manufactured metal rather than natural stone or brick. The discovery was completely unexpected, transforming Sarah's documentation visit into something far more intriguing. Historical buildings sometimes contained hidden storage areas or safes, particularly in southern states during the Reconstruction era when economic instability and political uncertainty had encouraged concealment of valuables. The Historical Society records had mentioned rumors about hidden compartments, but finding physical evidence of such features was extraordinary. Setting aside preservation disappointment, Sarah carefully photographed the discovery before continuing to investigate. The metal door appeared to have a simple latch mechanism rather than combination lock, suggesting it was designed for convenient access rather than high security. Decades of disuse had created corrosion that initially resisted Sarah's attempts to open the compartment, but persistent gentle pressure eventually freed the latch from accumulated grime. The door swung outward with reluctant creaking, revealing a chamber approximately 2 feet square built into the chimney structure. The space was lined with brick and appeared to have been deliberately constructed as part of the original building design rather than added during later modifications. Most remarkably, the chamber contained what appeared to be a wooden box, its surface darkened with age, but its construction still solid despite decades in concealment. Sarah carefully removed the box, noting its substantial weight and quality craftsmanship that had protected its contents from environmental deterioration. The container measured approximately 15 inches long by 10 inches wide, constructed from oak with dovetail joinery that suggested professional woodworking rather than utilitarian storage. Metal reinforcement at corners and edges provided additional structural integrity, while a simple brass latch secured the lid without requiring a key. Placing the box on the ticket counter where natural light from windows provided better visibility, Sarah photographed it from multiple angles before attempting to open it. The brass latch moved smoothly despite decades without use, suggesting quality materials that had resisted corrosion within the protected environment of the hidden chamber. The lid opened to reveal contents that immediately transformed Sarah's understanding of both the train station's significance and her own financial situation. Nestled in what appeared to be original cotton batting lay gold coins, their surfaces gleaming in the November sunlight, streaming through the station's dusty windows. The coins were arranged in neat rows, each positioned to prevent contact damage. During storage or transport, Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she carefully lifted one coin for closer examination, its weight confirming genuine gold rather than decorative replica. The coin's design featured Confederate imagery and the date 1861, identifying it as currency minted during the early Civil War period when Southern states had established independent monetary systems to finance their separation from the Union. The box contained approximately 60 similar coins, their collective value clearly substantial even without considering historical significance that would likely multiply their worth beyond merely precious metal content. Beneath the first layer of coins lay additional rows, suggesting the container held several hundred gold pieces that had remained hidden since the Reconstruction era. Most remarkable was a folded document nestled beside the coins, its aged paper still intact despite the passage of time. Sarah carefully unfolded the brittle page, revealing handwritten text dated April 1865, the final month of the Civil War, when Confederate government collapse had created chaos throughout southern states. The document appeared to be a transportation order signed by a Confederate Treasury official, directing movement of government assets from Richmond to secure locations in Georgia and Florida as Union forces advanced toward the Confederate capital. The specific reference to Oakwood Station Special Repository suggested the train depot had served as one of multiple designated secure locations for Confederate government valuables during the war's chaotic conclusion. Sarah's historical knowledge was sufficient to recognize the extraordinary significance of the document and coins, potentially representing part of the legendary lost Confederate treasury that had disappeared during the government's collapse. In 1865, historians had documented the evacuation of millions in gold and silver from Richmond as Union forces approached. But much of this wealth had vanished during the chaotic final weeks of the conflict, creating enduring historical mysteries about its ultimate disposition. The discovery transformed Sarah's preservation challenge from financial liability to extraordinary opportunity. The coins alone would likely exceed the value needed for complete station restoration, while their historical context potentially justified National Museum involvement that could provide resources and expertise beyond anything Sarah had previously considered possible. Yet the discovery also created new ethical and legal questions that required careful consideration before proceeding. The coins technically represented Confederate government property, raising complex questions about ownership rights that might involve federal government claims, state historical commissions, or legal precedents regarding abandoned property and treasure discovery. Sarah carefully returned the coins to their container and replaced the box in its hidden chamber, securing the fireplace stones to maintain the discovery's protection while she researched appropriate next steps. The station's deteriorated condition suddenly represented preservation of historical evidence rather than merely financial burden, creating new urgency about preventing further damage while proper archaeological and historical assessment was arranged. The drive back to Atlanta that evening gave Sarah time to process the extraordinary implications of her discovery. The abandoned train station that had seemed like an impulsive mistake had suddenly revealed historical significance beyond anything she had imagined when placing her $600 bid at the county auction. The financial challenges that had threatened to consume her remaining resources were potentially transformed into opportunity for both personal stability and historical preservation that honored Robert's professional values. Sarah spent that evening researching legal precedents regarding historical artifact discovery, learning that laws governing such findings varied by state and historical context. Confederate government assets represented particularly complex cases, with some precedents suggesting federal government claims while others supported finders' rights, particularly when discovered on private property purchased through legitimate means. The potential value of the coins was difficult to estimate without expert assessment, but similar Confederate gold pieces had sold at auction for prices ranging from $5,000 to $25,000 each, depending on condition, rarity, and historical provenance. The collection Sarah had discovered could potentially be worth millions if properly authenticated and legally established as her property. More importantly, the historical document potentially provided context that would interest major museums and research institutions, creating possibilities for preservation partnerships that could address the station's restoration needs while maintaining its historical integrity and educational value to the community. The historical society position that had initially seemed merely supplementary income now represented valuable, professional connection to resources and expertise that could help navigate the complex intersection of historical significance, legal, ownership, and preservation responsibility. Margaret Reynolds would likely have connections to appropriate authorities who could provide guidance while protecting the discovery from exploitation or damage. Sarah slept little that night, her mind racing with both possibilities and concerns about how to proceed responsibly. The discovery could potentially solve her financial challenges while preserving an important historical structure, yet required careful handling to ensure legal compliance and appropriate protection for artifacts with national historical significance. The financial devastation that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier had been replaced by possibility that exceeded anything Sarah could have imagined when making her impulsive purchase. The train station that had represented connection to Robert's memory now offered potential for both personal recovery and contribution to historical understanding that would honor his professional values while creating new purpose beyond grief and financial struggle. The following morning, Sarah contacted Margaret Reynolds to arrange an urgent meeting, explaining only that she had made a significant discovery at the station that required historical expertise and professional guidance. The conversation would begin a process that would transform not only Sarah's personal circumstances, but historical understanding of how Confederate assets had been distributed during the Civil War's chaotic conclusion. The train station that had seemed like a desperate mistake was about to become the center of archaeological and historical investigation that would rewrite textbooks while providing Sarah with resources beyond anything she had imagined possible when placing her $600 bid at the county auction. Margaret Reynolds arrived at the Oakwood station within an hour of Sarah's call, her expression reflecting both professional curiosity and personal concern about the urgency in Sarah's voice. The Historical Society director had brought her camera, notebook, and white cotton gloves typically used for handling delicate historical documents, standard equipment for preliminary artifact assessment that would prove woefully inadequate for the magnitude of what Sarah was about to reveal. "You sounded quite mysterious on the phone," Margaret commented as Sarah unlocked the station's main entrance. "What exactly have you discovered that couldn't wait until our regular meeting tomorrow?" Sarah led Margaret directly to the fireplace, explaining how structural damage had revealed anomalies in the stonework that suggested deliberate modification rather than random deterioration. "I was documenting water damage for insurance purposes when I noticed this section had shifted," Sarah explained, pointing to the area where loosened stones had revealed the hidden chamber. "What I found behind it is something I believe needs immediate professional attention." Margaret watched with growing interest as Sarah carefully removed the stones she had replaced for security, creating access to the concealed metal door within the chimney structure. The Historical Society director's professional demeanor momentarily faltered when Sarah opened the compartment and carefully removed the wooden box, placing it on a clean tarp she had brought specifically for the presentation. This was hidden in a chamber built into the chimney, Sarah explained, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was sharing. "I believe it's been there since the late 1860s, based on the document inside." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she donned her cotton gloves before accepting Sarah's invitation to examine the contents. The historian's extensive experience with regional artifacts allowed her to immediately recognize the extraordinary significance of the Confederate gold coins. Her quick intake of breath confirming that Sarah's discovery exceeded normal historical finds. "These appear to be authentic Confederate gold pieces," Margaret confirmed, carefully examining one coin without removing it from the box. "Likely minted in New Orleans or Richmond before those mints were captured by Union forces. The condition is remarkable. They've been protected from environmental damage by the sealed chamber." When Margaret unfolded the accompanying document, her professional composure completely dissolved, replaced by undisguised excitement that transformed her academic reserve into animated enthusiasm. "This is extraordinary," she whispered, carefully, examining the faded handwriting and official signatures. "This appears to be a Confederate Treasury transport order from April 1865, during the government's collapse and evacuation from Richmond. The document's specific reference to Treasury assets relocated from secondary repositories to designated tertiary locations aligned with historical accounts of Confederate officials dispersing government gold and silver reserves as Union forces advanced through Virginia and the Carolinas during the war's final weeks. Most remarkably, the document listed Oakwood Station as Repository Site 12, with specific reference to 75 pounds gold specie and associated instruments, a description that matched the contents of the wooden box. "Sarah, do you understand what you've discovered?" Margaret asked, her voice reflecting both academic excitement and concern about proper handling. "This appears to be part of the lost Confederate Treasury, government assets that disappeared during the fall of Richmond and have been the subject of historical mystery for over 150 years. The magnitude of the discovery exceeded even Sarah's initial assessment, creating implications that extended beyond personal financial considerations to questions of national historical significance. The lost Confederate Treasury represented one of American history's enduring mysteries, with millions in government gold and silver having disappeared during the chaotic final weeks of the Civil War. We need to contact appropriate authorities immediately," Margaret continued, already reaching for her phone. "This discovery requires professional archaeological assessment, security arrangements, and legal consultation regarding ownership and preservation requirements." The phrase "legal consultation" triggered Sarah's first concern about potential complications that might accompany her extraordinary find. The financial lifeline represented by the gold coins suddenly seemed less certain as questions of ownership rights emerged. "The station is my property," Sarah noted carefully. "Purchased legally through county auction with clear title transfer. Wouldn't anything found within the building be legally mine as well?" Margaret's hesitation revealed the complexity awaiting Sarah's discovery. Historical artifacts, particularly those potentially connected to government assets, sometimes involve specialized legal considerations, she explained diplomatically. Confederate government property represents particularly complex cases that have established specific precedents regarding ownership rights. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the golden solution to her financial problems might be more complicated than simply selling valuable coins. The discovery that had momentarily seemed like miraculous intervention could potentially become entangled in legal proceedings that might ultimately grant ownership to government entities rather than the property owner who had discovered the hidden cash. "What should we do next?" Sarah asked, recognizing that regardless of ultimate ownership determination, proper historical handling required expertise beyond her knowledge. The coins and document represented irreplaceable historical evidence that deserved professional protection regardless of how ownership questions might eventually be resolved. Margaret's response balanced professional responsibility with personal loyalty to Sarah, who had entrusted her with the discovery rather than attempting to sell the coins privately or concealing the find from proper authorities. "First, we document everything exactly as discovered, creating proper chain of custody records. Then we contact the State Historical Commission and possibly federal authorities who have established protocols for handling discoveries of this significance." The following days transformed Sarah's world in ways that exceeded any expectations she had formed since purchasing the abandoned station. The initial documentation visit from the State Historical Commission expanded to include representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, the Department of the Treasury's Historical Division, and university archaeologists specializing in Civil War-era artifacts. The station property that had seemed worthless to county officials during the tax assessment appeal suddenly received constant monitoring from security professionals hired by the Historical Commission to protect what was rapidly being recognized as a discovery of national significance. The leaking roof that Sarah couldn't afford to repair was promptly stabilized through emergency preservation funding that materialized within 48 hours of the coin's discovery. Most remarkably, the hidden chamber behind the fireplace proved to be merely the beginning of discoveries that would ultimately rewrite historical understanding of Confederate treasury movements during the government's collapse. Ground-penetrating radar examination revealed additional sealed vaults beneath the station's main floor, suggesting that Oakwood had served as a more significant repository than the initial discovery indicated. Sarah watched with mixed emotions as her simple train station transformed into an archaeological research site surrounded by equipment, specialists, and security measures that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier when she faced condemnation, notices, and tax foreclosure. The property she had purchased for $600 was suddenly the center of national historical interest. Yet questions about her legal rights to the discovered artifacts remained unresolved. "The collection's historical significance is extraordinary," explained Dr. James Harrington, the Smithsonian representative who had arrived 3 days after Sarah's initial discovery. "Beyond merely financial value, these artifacts provide documentation of government asset movement that transforms our understanding of the Confederacy's final weeks." The archaeological excavation of the station's previously unknown subterranean vaults revealed additional wooden crates containing not only gold and silver coins, but government bonds, printing plates for Confederate currency, and ledgers documenting Treasury operations during the war's final months. The total value of precious metals alone exceeded $100 million at current market rates, while the historical significance of the documentation was effectively priceless to researchers and institutions. Through this whirlwind of activity, Sarah maintained daily presence at the station, watching professionals document and preserve artifacts from her property while questions of ownership remained unaddressed. Her part-time work at the Historical Society had been temporarily suspended as Margaret devoted full attention to the archaeological process, leaving Sarah without even that modest income while legal considerations regarding the discovery proceeded through state and federal channels. "What happens now?" Sarah asked Dr. Harrington 2 weeks into the excavation, when the extent of the discovery had been documented, but no official determination regarding ownership had been communicated. "The station is still my property, purchased legally. Don't I have rights to what was discovered inside it?" The Smithsonian representative's response revealed the complexity awaiting resolution. Finders' rights versus government claims regarding Confederate assets have established legal precedents, he explained carefully. The Treasury Department has historical claim to government assets, while state historical preservation laws create additional considerations regarding artifacts discovered within protected structures. The uncertainty created continued anxiety. For Sarah, who watched valuable artifacts being cataloged and removed from her property while her financial situation remained precarious. The tax obligations and structural requirements that had threatened her ownership before the discovery remained technically in effect, creating the ironic possibility that she might lose the property through foreclosure even as millions in gold and silver were excavated from beneath its foundations. 5 weeks after Sarah's initial discovery, representatives from the Treasury Department, State Historical Commission, and county government requested a formal meeting to discuss resolution of competing claims regarding the artifacts. Sarah arrived at the county administration building accompanied by an attorney, provided through the State Bar Association's pro bono program for owners of historically significant properties, her financial situation qualifying her for legal assistance despite the potential value of her discovery. The meeting represented pivotal determination of whether Sarah's impulsive purchase would ultimately provide financial salvation or merely historical footnote in her personal narrative of loss and recovery. The conference room contained 12 representatives from various government entities, each with established positions regarding ownership rights to Confederate government assets discovered on private property. Ms. Mitchell, we appreciate your cooperation throughout this extraordinary process, began Robert Anderson, the Treasury Department's legal representative. Your discovery has provided invaluable historical documentation while potentially resolving mysteries about Confederate asset movement that have persisted for over 150 years. The acknowledgement was professionally delivered but offered no indication about the Treasury's position regarding ownership rights. Sarah waited as representatives from each entity presented legal arguments and historical precedents related to the discovery, the discussion becoming increasingly technical as competing statutes and court decisions were cited regarding similar cases. Federal courts have consistently recognized government claims to identified Treasury assets, regardless of discovery circumstances, the Treasury representative noted, citing cases from the 1990s involving Confederate currency printing plates found in bank vaults in Tennessee and Louisiana. The State Historical Commission countered with preservation statutes that granted discovery rights to property owners who followed proper reporting procedures for historical artifacts, while the county representative reminded everyone that property taxes remained unpaid, potentially invalidating ownership claims altogether if foreclosure proceeded. As the technical discussion continued, Sarah felt increasingly invisible in a room where her future was being determined through legal arguments that seemed disconnected from the human reality of her situation. The widow who had purchased an abandoned train station with her last resources was becoming mere procedural detail in discussions about institutional claims and statutory interpretations. When finally invited to speak, Sarah abandoned the prepared statement her attorney had drafted, instead addressing the room with personal perspective that momentarily silenced the legal arguments. My husband spent his career preserving historic architecture, she began, her voice steady despite the stakes involved. He believed that buildings tell our shared stories and connect us to something larger than individual lives. The personal introduction shifted the room's atmosphere, reminding institutional representatives that legal determinations affected a real person, whose circumstances warranted consideration beyond merely statutory application. I purchased the station because it represented connection to my husband's values and potential contribution to preserving community history that might otherwise be lost. Sarah described her financial challenges following Robert's death, the impulsive purchase that had seemed like financial mistake until the discovery, and her consistent commitment to proper handling of artifacts despite personal financial pressure that might have encouraged private sale or concealment. I've cooperated fully because history belongs to everyone, not just whoever happens to find it. But my cooperation has come at significant personal cost, while institutional interests have been protected. The human context transformed the discussion's tone, creating space for compromise that institutional representatives began exploring through consultation with colleagues and supervisors via texts and calls during a brief recess. When the meeting reconvened, Robert Anderson presented a proposal that acknowledged both government claims and Sarah's rights as property owner and discoverer. The Treasury Department recognizes legitimate government interest in recovered Confederate assets while acknowledging Ms. Mitchell's legal property rights and exemplary handling of historically significant artifacts. Anderson explained, "We propose settlement that addresses all parties' interests while ensuring proper historical preservation." The proposal recognized divided ownership, certain coins and artifacts, with specific historical significance, would become government property housed in appropriate museums and research institutions, while other items, particularly duplicate coins without unique historical provenance, would be legally established as Sarah's property in recognition of her discovery rights and cooperation with authorities. Additionally, the Treasury Department would provide restoration funding for the train station through historical preservation programs, ensuring the building's rehabilitation while establishing protected status that prevented future demolition or inappropriate development. The State Historical Commission would assume certain restoration costs while establishing educational programs that acknowledge the station's significance in American history. Most immediately beneficial for Sarah, the county agreed to recalculate property taxes based on historical designation rather than commercial valuation, creating manageable annual obligations that recognize the property's cultural significance rather than potential development value. The tax reassessment would be retroactive, eliminating the immediate foreclosure threat while establishing sustainable ownership costs moving forward. The compromise acknowledged competing interests while recognizing Sarah's personal circumstances and contribution to historical discovery. Approximately 40% of the recovered gold and silver coins would become her legal property once proper documentation and authentication were completed. A portion, representing millions in potential value that would transform her financial situation while ensuring institutional access to historically significant artifacts. 2 months after Sarah's initial discovery, the formal settlement agreement was signed by all parties, establishing clear ownership rights while ensuring proper historical preservation. The media coverage that followed transformed Sarah from anonymous widow to national figure whose story captured public imagination about possibilities hidden within overlooked historical structures throughout the country. Widow finds Confederate gold worth millions in $600 train station became headline news, creating both opportunities and challenges as Sarah navigated sudden publicity while establishing plans for her portion of the discovery's value. Television, interviews and newspaper features shared her story of loss, impulsive purchase, and historic discovery that had transformed financial desperation into opportunity for both personal recovery and historical preservation. The financial implications were life-changing once authentication confirmed the coin's legitimacy and historical significance. Sarah's portion minus 212 gold coins and 147 silver pieces represented market value exceeding $8 million, though historical provenance and documented discovery circumstances potentially increased their worth significantly beyond precious metal content. Auction houses contacted Sarah with competing proposals for handling sales, each offering expertise in maximizing value through proper marketing to collectors and institutions interested in Civil War artifacts with established provenance. Financial security that had seemed impossibly distant during Sarah's darkest moments was suddenly within reach, requiring careful management rather than desperate measures for survival. Yet Sarah found herself surprisingly measured in addressing her newfound financial opportunities, approaching decisions with perspective shaped by both loss and unexpected discovery. Rather than immediately selling all coins for maximum profit, she developed thoughtful strategy for balancing immediate needs with longer-term security and meaningful legacy. I want decisions that honor both the discovery's historical significance and my husband's preservation values, Sarah explained to financial advisors who recommended immediate liquidation for maximum return. This isn't merely about personal gain, but responsible stewardship of something historically meaningful. The approach materialized in Sarah's decision to donate 10 particularly significant coins to regional museums, ensuring public access to historical artifacts while establishing philanthropic foundation for her remaining financial decisions. The gesture received recognition from historical organizations while creating tax benefits that partially offset gains from coins she did sell through carefully structured auctions. The majority of Sarah's portion was sold through reputable auction houses specializing in historical artifacts, generating approximately $12.3 million after commission and authentication costs. The proceeds were carefully managed through financial advisors specializing in sudden wealth management, creating diversified investments that provided both immediate resources and long-term security. Most remarkably, Sarah dedicated significant resources toward the train station's complete restoration, transforming the dilapidated structure into combined historical museum and community educational center that preserved both architectural significance and historical context of the Confederate treasury discovery. The rehabilitation employed Robert's preservation principles, maintaining original materials and craftsmanship while adapting interior spaces for modern educational purposes. The building's story continues through new purpose that honors its past while serving today's community. Sarah explained during the station museum's opening, 18 months after her initial discovery. The facility featured exhibits documenting both Civil War history and archaeological process that had revealed nationally significant artifacts beneath the seemingly abandoned building. The museum's second floor included research libraries specializing in regional Civil War history, named in Robert's memory and featuring architectural preservation resources that connected to his professional passion. The collection included his journals and technical references, creating educational resources for students and professionals interested in historical building preservation. The station that had once represented Sarah's financial desperation became community gathering place, educational resource, and economic catalyst for Oakwood's modest revitalization. Tourism increased as visitors traveled to view the discovery site, creating opportunities for local businesses and renewed interest in the town's historical significance within regional development. Personally, Sarah established comfortable but modest lifestyle that balanced financial security with meaningful purpose. Rather than returning to Atlanta, she purchased and renovated a small Victorian home within walking distance of the station museum, establishing permanent residence in the community where her extraordinary discovery had occurred. The historical society position that had initially represented mere survival employment evolved into museum directorship that utilized both Sarah's educational background and newly developed expertise in historical preservation. The part-time role expanded to full-time professional position supported by endowment created through portion of the discovery proceeds, ensuring sustainable operation beyond initial tourism interest. Most meaningful was Sarah's establishment of educational foundation, providing scholarships for students pursuing studies in historical preservation, archaeology, and architectural restoration. The program, named for Robert, created opportunities for young people interested in connecting contemporary communities with historical structures that might otherwise face demolition or neglect. Emily returned from Spain after completing her teaching contract, initially planning brief visit, but ultimately establishing her own connections to Oakwood's community through teaching position at local schools, where she developed specialized curriculum connecting students with regional history through primary source research and archaeological principles. "I never expected to find myself teaching in rural Georgia," Emily admitted during community presentation about her educational programs. "But there's something powerful about helping young people discover connections between their communities, physical structures, and broader historical narratives." Mother and daughter established new relationship built on shared purpose rather than merely family obligation. Their professional collaboration creating educational resources that extended beyond Oakwood to regional school systems interested in connecting classroom learning with physical historical sites. The partnership honored Robert's preservation values while creating educational legacy that transcended merely financial security. 3 years after purchasing the abandoned train station that had initially seemed like desperate mistake, Sarah hosted historical preservation conference that brought professionals from throughout the Southeast to Oakwood. The gathering focused on identifying and protecting potential historical sites in rural communities, represented transformation from personal discovery to broader mission of ensuring other overlooked structures received proper assessment before facing demolition. Sometimes preservation requires looking beyond obvious deterioration to recognize historical significance that isn't immediately visible. Sarah explained during her keynote address. Buildings that seem merely abandoned may contain both architectural value and historical documentation that connect us with otherwise inaccessible narratives. The gathering included workshops on assessment techniques, funding strategies for rural preservation projects, and educational programming that created community investment in historical structures. Sarah's experience provided case study in how seemingly worthless properties might contain both architectural significance and unexpected historical documentation that warranted professional evaluation before demolition. The widow who had once faced financial ruin had become a respected voice in regional preservation community, her experience demonstrating how personal initiative could sometimes reveal historical significance that institutional evaluation had overlooked. The train station that county officials had considered liability, requiring demolition, had become centerpiece of community identity and economic development through combination of individual courage and professional collaboration. The most valuable discoveries often remain hidden until someone cares enough to look beyond surface deterioration, Sarah noted during interview about the station's transformation. Sometimes what appears worthless contains exactly what we need, not just financially, but in connecting us with something larger than individual circumstances. The financial security that Sarah had gained through the Confederate gold discovery provided freedom from the desperate survival mode that had dominated her life after Robert's death. Yet the greater transformation came through renewed purpose that connected personal recovery with community development and historical preservation that would outlast merely individual benefit. The train station that had once represented Sarah's most desperate financial decision had become foundation for legacy that honored Robert's memory while creating new possibilities for both personal fulfillment and community development. The discovery that had initially seemed like miraculous financial salvation had ultimately provided something more valuable, purpose that transformed personal loss into meaningful contribution to historical understanding and community identity. I thought I was purchasing a building, Sarah reflected during the preservation conference. But what I actually found was connection to something that extends beyond individual circumstances or temporary financial concerns. Sometimes our most desperate decisions reveal possibilities we couldn't have imagined when merely trying to survive. Immediate challenges. The transformation was complete, but the journey continued through educational programs, preservation initiatives, and community development that would extend beyond Sarah's lifetime. The abandoned train station had become vehicle for legacy that connected past, present, and future through physical structure that might easily have been lost without one widow's impulsive decision to invest her last resources in possibility, rather than merely immediate security. 5 years after Sarah Mitchell's life-changing discovery, the Oakwood Station Museum welcomed its 100,000th visitor, a milestone that transformed what many had once considered an impossible preservation project into one of Georgia's most successful rural heritage sites. The celebration coincided with the museum's expansion, adding a new research wing dedicated to Civil War economic history that would house scholars and students from universities across the country. When we cut this ribbon, Sarah told the gathered crowd of community members and preservation specialists, we're not just celebrating a building saved or artifacts discovered. We're honoring how history connects us across generations when we have the courage to look beyond surface appearances. At 57, Sarah carried herself with quiet confidence that reflected her journey from desperate widow to respected preservationist. Her silver-streaked hair and weathered hands spoke of both challenges overcome and purpose discovered through circumstances that had initially seemed like financial catastrophe. The former elementary school librarian now lectured at universities about historic preservation and consulted with communities throughout the Southeast about identifying overlooked historical assets within rural settings. The train station that had once represented Sarah's financial desperation had become the centerpiece of regional heritage tourism, drawing visitors fascinated by both Civil War history and the unlikely discovery story that had transformed one woman's desperate purchase into national historical revelation. More significantly, the station had catalyzed community revitalization that extended far beyond merely tourism economics. Oakwood's once struggling Main Street now featured restored Victorian storefronts housing specialty shops, restaurants, and professional services that served both visitors and local residents. The coffee shop where Sarah often started her mornings occupied a former hardware store whose facade had been meticulously restored through preservation grant programs that Sarah had helped establish for commercial buildings with historical significance. The ripple effects of preservation extend beyond merely saving individual structures, noted Governor Eleanor Harrington, who had traveled to Oakwood for the museum expansion ceremony. What Sarah Mitchell started with one building has transformed an entire community's understanding of how historical assets create both economic opportunity and cultural identity. The museum expansion had been funded primarily through the Confederate Gold Foundation that Sarah had established with proceeds from her portion of the discovery. The organization supported preservation projects throughout the region while funding scholarships for students pursuing careers in archaeology, historical documentation, and architectural preservation, fields that connected Sarah's experience with opportunities for future generations. Most remarkably, the Foundation's work had led to 7 additional significant historical discoveries throughout Georgia and neighboring states. As communities applied assessment protocols Sarah had developed for identifying potential historical repositories within overlooked structures, none had matched the Oakwood discovery's magnitude, but each had revealed historical documentation that transformed understanding of regional development during the Reconstruction era. We've learned to look beyond obvious deterioration to recognize potential historical significance, explained Dr. Elizabeth Warner, the Foundation's research director. Sarah's experience demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable historical assets remain hidden until someone asks different questions about seemingly worthless structures. The academic validation represented profound transformation from the desperate circumstances that had driven Sarah's initial purchase. The widow who had once faced foreclosure and financial ruin now directed preservation initiatives with multi-million-dollar budgets, her experience providing credibility that conventional academic credentials couldn't match when addressing rural communities suspicious of outside experts. Yet Sarah's most meaningful accomplishment wasn't measured through visitor statistics or economic impact reports. Walking through Oakwood's revitalized downtown after the ceremony, she paused to watch local high school students conducting architectural documentation of commercial buildings that previous generations had considered unremarkable. The preservation education program she had developed with Emily connected teenagers with their community's physical history, teaching technical skills while developing appreciation for craftsmanship that predated their digital world. Ms. Mitchell, we found another mason's mark on the Ferguson building cornerstone, called 16-year-old Marcus Jefferson, president of the high school preservation club that Sarah and Emily had established 4 years earlier. It matches the symbol we documented on the train station's foundation. Might be the same builder from the 1880s. Sarah joined the students, examining their discovery with genuine interest that honored their developing expertise. The teenagers had initially joined the program for community service credits required for graduation, but many had discovered unexpected passion for historical detective work that revealed connections between physical structures and community, narratives previously unknown to lifelong residents. That's significant documentation, Sarah confirmed, her enthusiasm reinforcing the discovery's importance. You're establishing construction patterns that help us understand how the community developed after the railroad's arrival. The interaction represented everything Sarah valued about her unexpected life transformation, connecting young people with tangible history while developing skills that might shape their future career choices. 3 former Preservation Club Members were currently attending university with foundation scholarships, pursuing degrees in fields ranging from architectural engineering to cultural anthropology. Later that evening, Sarah welcomed special guests to her restored Victorian home 3 blocks from the museum, a dinner celebration that brought together people who had supported her journey from various perspectives. Margaret Reynolds, now retired from the Historical Society, but still actively involved with the museum's educational programs, arrived first, bringing photographs from the initial discovery that documented how dramatically circumstances had changed over 5 years. "Remember how terrified we were about proper protocols?" Margaret laughed, showing Sarah images of their improvised documentation methods before professional archaeologists had arrived. "We were using my digital camera and notebook when we should have had an archaeological team and security specialists." The memories highlighted how completely unprepared they had been for the discovery's magnitude, a finding that would eventually involve the Smithsonian Institution, Treasury Department, and university research teams investigating what proved to be the largest recovery of Confederate government assets since the Civil War's conclusion. The amateur preservation enthusiasts had suddenly found themselves at the center of historical discovery that rewrote academic understanding of how Confederate treasury movements had occurred during the government's collapse. Emily arrived with her husband Miguel, a restoration specialist she had met during an architectural preservation conference 3 years earlier. Their 2-year-old daughter Sophia represented the next generation of the family legacy, already familiar with the museum, where both parents worked developing educational programs that connected historical preservation with community development initiatives. Sophia insisted on bringing her preservation toolkit, Emily explained as the toddler proudly displayed miniature versions of documentation tools that her parents used for architectural assessment. "She's already telling everyone she's going to save old buildings like Grandpa and Grandma." The reference to Robert's indirect influence on his granddaughter brought momentary emotion to Sarah's expression. The connection between her late husband's values and future generations, representing legacy that transcended both financial security and professional accomplishment. The family continuity through preservation work created meaning that Sarah couldn't have imagined during her darkest moments following Robert's death. Dr. James Harrington from the Smithsonian arrived with his research assistant, bearing advance copies of their forthcoming book documenting the Confederate Treasury's final movements based on records discovered beneath the Oakwood Station. The publication, which acknowledged Sarah's crucial role in preserving historical documentation that might otherwise have been lost through demolition, represented academic validation of the discovery's national significance. The Oakwood discovery fundamentally transformed our understanding of how Confederate assets were distributed during the government's collapse. Dr. Harrington explained during dinner, his academic enthusiasm evident despite having studied the materials for 5 years. The documentation Sarah preserved provides previously unknown details about Treasury operations that contradict long-standing historical assumptions. The gathered company represented different aspects of the transformation that had occurred since Sarah's desperate purchase: academic validation, community development, family legacy, and professional networks that connected her unlikely discovery with broader historical narratives. The widow who had once faced financial ruin had become nexus connecting institutional resources with community needs through preservation work that transcended merely individual accomplishment. After dinner, Sarah shared news that she had been saving for this particular gathering, information that would further extend the discovery's impact beyond anything they had initially imagined possible. "The National Historic Preservation Trust has approved our proposal for a Southeastern Preservation Center based at Oakwood Station," she announced, distributing planning documents showing expanded facilities and educational programs. The center would provide training for rural communities throughout the Southeast, teaching assessment protocols and documentation techniques that helped identify historically significant structures before deterioration or demolition eliminated valuable cultural resources. The program would create permanent academic positions, professional certification opportunities, and community outreach initiatives that institutionalize SARA's preservation approaches. They've approved initial funding of $12 million. SARA continued, the figure representing validation beyond merely financial support. With matching grants from state historical commissions and private foundations, we'll establish programming that extends well beyond Oakwood while maintaining our community as the operational center. The announcement represented transformation from individual discovery to institutional legacy that would continue regardless of SARA's personal involvement. The preservation approaches she had developed through necessity had evolved into methodologies recognized by national organizations as best practices for identifying overlooked historical assets within rural communities with limited resources. The center will include residential facilities for visiting scholars and community representatives, SARA explained, showing architectural renderings for additions that complemented the station's Victorian design while providing modern research capabilities. Will host intensive training programs that communities can implement regardless of their economic circumstances. The expansion would create 17 permanent positions, ranging from administrative support to research directors, with additional opportunities for graduate students and preservation fellows conducting fieldwork throughout the region. The economic impact for Oakwood would be substantial, but more significant was the community's transformation into a recognized center for preservation, expertise that attracted academic and professional interest internationally. Most meaningful for SARA was the center's educational focus on communities typically overlooked by major preservation initiatives. We're specifically designing programs for rural areas where historical structures face demolition because their significance hasn't been professionally documented, she explained, her passion evident as she described communities similar to what Oakwood had been before her discovery. The gathering celebrated late into the evening, the conversations moving between professional planning and personal reflections on how completely circumstances had changed since SARA's desperate purchase of an abandoned train station with her last financial resources.